Hi everyone, I'm Josh, if you don't know me. I need to apologise if I start to drawl. It's probably the jet lag and the fact that I have an incredibly porous palate. I only need to stand next to someone who speaks differently and my accent goes all funny. This thing's going to make an annoying noise and I may take it off later. So this is kind of an introduction of me to this program. What I want to talk about is American content in Australia and the way in which it's made domestic by the branding strategies and the scheduling strategies of Australian networks. I'm going to truncate some of the things that I want to say to try and get to the end a little bit more rapidly, because a lot of the things that a lot of the challenges I think that Australian networks are facing in the current era reflect back on a lot of the things that we've already heard in the meetings thus far. So that's where we're going. Oh, this is an old television set from Australia. Australia used to have a television manufacturing industry back in 1956. There's a company called Astor, and I'll talk about them a little bit later, and they used to make televisions. And this isn't one of theirs, this is an AWA set, but this is an old Australian television. Bringing things together. Okay, so, as I said, I look at the role that American content plays on Australian television. And look at the way in which it's localized, because in many respects, lots of American content is natural. They use the evil bunnies because natural is one of those contested, dirty terms, and I'm going to apply it kind of judiciously across this presentation. And then I'll look at the kind of challenges that are faced by the networks. But I want to start by talking about Katie Holmes, who I realise she is now perhaps a little bit crazy, but at the time, and this is work that is based on my PhD thesis. At the time, Katie Holmes was a principal motivator for me writing a PhD. I wrote my PhD about Dawson's Creek, and specifically about young people and the representation of young people on Australian television. And so Katie Holmes was important to me, partly because she's attractive and a kind of wholesome teen star, and if anything, she probably shows my own bias towards seemingly intelligent brunettes more than anything else. But for a core period throughout the 90s, Dawson's Creek was a core site where youth could be seen on Australian television. And this is, I don't know how well you can see this, this is about 10 years or 12 years in Australia's television history. And these are all of the programs that represented youth in the 10-year, 12-year period that I worked at when I was doing my thesis. These dark ones in, if I can find my pointer. These dark ones in dark blue, these blue ones in dark blue, are all of the American programs, all of the American teen dramas that represented young people on Australian television. And you'll see that most of them are the exceptional or quite successful iterations of the genre. Against these kind of American programs, we have a series of domestic programs, but there's a distinction here. This represents 4 of the networks. I'm going to talk in a minute about the Australian television environment. But what we see are the 4 of the networks, and the important thing about this table is to point out that all of the American content predominantly screens on the commercial networks. And all of the domestic content predominantly, in terms of representing young people, screens on the public broadcaster. And that is kind of important for the things that I'm about to say, so I might stop justifying things and get on. So my thesis was about these 2 programs. Okay, on the right we have Dawson's Creek. I'm going to presume now that people are familiar with Dawson's Creek and this ridiculous, incredibly post-ironic and post-modern homespun fantasy tale about a stalker, his giant forehead and his love for the girl next door. On the other side, we have Heartbreak High. Now, Heartbreak High was a really interesting Australian program. It was based on a film called The Heartbreak Kid, and it was a spin-off, and it was a teen drama. It was about kids in like this gritty urban high school in Sydney. It was commissioned by Channel 10, and 10 is a youth-specific broadcaster in Australia. It lasted about 12 months on Channel 10 before it was shunted to 11 o'clock and then passed off to the ABC. It lasted 8 years on the ABC. Now that may not mean much to you, except that our public broadcaster doesn't have the money to produce content. So Heartbreak High was an international co-production that by the end of its life was being nearly wholly funded by the BBC, a French production company, a German production company, and a smattering of money coming from 18 other countries, including places like Israel and Tanzania and stuff. Anyway, so these were the two programs that I was looking at. This one, because it represented for a point the genre that represented youth on Australian television, and this one because it was a domestic program that couldn't manage to be successful despite the fact that it gave off an accurate and quite compelling vision of Australian youthfulness. And what this points to a certain extent is the fact that American content assumes this natural place on Australian television in certain instances. And that's what I want to talk about. Australia, the Australian Television Network, I just want a brief overview. We have a dual system that is apparently unique in the world. We have two publicly funded broadcasters, the ABC and the SBS. The SBS I'm not going to talk about. It's a multicultural channel that is fantastic. It's part publicly funded and part commercial funded. The other three channels on Australian television are commercial. The invention of television in Australia was a post-war invention. It came in 56, and we imported the public broadcasting from the BBC and the commercial model from the US. And that distinction has remained for a long time, in that in addition to producing domestic content, and there is a requirement that all stations produce domestic content, the public broadcaster generally imports programs from the BBC, and the commercial broadcasters generally import programs from the US. And these are some figures, they're not mine, they're from the AFC, the Australian Film Commission, which does this progressive update of what Australians are producing and watching. And so what we can see is that by the time we get to 2003 and 2004, we've got 53 stations. They're linked together into 5 national networks. And it's the national networks that I'll talk about when I talk about channels, because they generally dictate programming, a lot like the affiliate system here, but there's less autonomy. And what we're importing is $226.7 million worth of drama, and only $104 million worth of other programming. So the largest bulk of our import is drama. And you can see that the expenditure on Australian drama is only $115 million. So we're importing kind of roughly twice what we're spending. The majority of the content that is imported, the drama content, screens during prime time. So whilst the networks are required to screen 55% of Australian content during prime time in order to maintain their licenses, the bulk of the content that they import is drama, and it screens during prime time. So what the Australian networks produce is a little bit of drama and a lot of lifestyle programming. We buy a lot of formats, like Endemol sells us a whole bunch of things. We have Idol, we have Big Brother. For a time we had Survivor, but it was really bad. Like they sent people to the West Coast. Australia's a big country, right? It's a giant island as it is. But what they did was take a bunch of Sydney-siders and send them kind of a couple hours north of Perth, which is the westernmost point in the world or something. But they were 4 kilometres from a shop. How does that work as a Survivor concept? Anyway, it tanked, and now we have the American Survivor, and it does particularly well. The point of this is to point out that for the drama programming, 29.1% of the total broadcast hours are drama programming, but only 25% of the total broadcast hours are Australian drama programming. These are the top 40 programs for 2004. And what you see is that despite the fact that primetime is dominated by imported programs, particularly from 8:30 onwards, often you'll get 2 episodes of CSI back to back, 8:30 through 10:30. The top programs are still predominantly Australian, because what sells, or what scores in the ratings are live events. So it's often sporting events. Idol did particularly well in 2004. It was only 2 years earlier that a non-sporting program was the top program in the country. And so in terms of top programs, the amount of drama that we import is severely underrepresented. So I'm not trying to suggest that the Australian broadcasting environment is dominated by imported content, or that domestic content doesn't score well with viewers. It does. But if we look at the top dramas for 2004, we see that they are predominantly imported. Now that's not surprising given the amount of drama that we import. My whole point is that this is not a problem in Australia. And this is just a little graph to show you that the spend. The top is the export spend in millions, and these are all Australian figures. So I think it's like one of them to get the American spend. But predominantly we're importing close to 300 million from the USA, and probably about 75 million from the UK, and some from elsewhere. Now, that's what I'm going in a minute. And so what I think happens here is that all of this imported program is made to cohere to domestic logics. American content has always had a very, very natural place on Australian television. When television was introduced in 1956, there was one of the first programs was by Astor, who was making sets. It was called This Is Television, and it screened on the 16th of September in Sydney, 1956. And it was basically a half-hour promotional reel for television itself. The first half was about how television was going to be producing televisions, the physical sets, was going to be a substantial post-war industry. And Australia was going to be a world leader in producing sets. It was going to revitalise our economy. And there's this wonderful footage. I tried to bring it with me, but Custom didn't let me bring it. No. There's this wonderful footage of all of these post-war women and their post-war labour just being moved from making bullets and stuff to assembling boxes and putting exciting stuff in boxes. And we still export cathode-ray tubes. So, industry, yeah. But the other half of This Is Television talked about the fact that television would bring us a whole new world right into your home. Television offered a range of carefully selected shows in every category screened at the most suitable time for the particular audience, including, for the whole family, the extremely popular Leave It to Beaver, award-winning detective series Dragnet, from the Master of Suspense, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and comedy and laughs for everyone, such as The Burns and Allen Show, and all the kids enjoy all the stars of the cartoon world, such as Ruff and Reddy. Basically, television was imported to Australia as an American commodity, as it was. There was some mention made of the fact that they would also bring top English and domestic stars into your home, but generally, the new world that television would offer was one that would bring a wonderful world of entertainment from outside into Australia. The development of the domestic market was kind of a secondary thought. And this is the introduction, this is the school kids in early 60s in country Australia being told how to use a television. Now the presence of American content in Australia enabled us very quickly to start television. We didn't have to go through the rigmarole of working out how to make it ourselves. We had these wonderful models, but we also had a whole lot of content. So from the word go, we had like a 6 or an 8 hour schedule. Within the space of about 8 or 10 years, we had a close to a 24-hour schedule because we had a whole lot of content. Australian programmers talk with some pride about the fact that we can import content. We get the best television in the world because the fact that we speak English means that we can import from the 2 largest English-speaking markets. Despite this, American television still gets blamed, or despite the fact that American television is a natural part of the Australian television experience, it still gets blamed for destroying our kids. There's a whole lot of this that happens in Australia, and it's a pathology about who we are, and it's a pathology about technology. So no one take it personally, because no one actually knows the people here. And this is from a guy called Walter Penzing, who wrote in this is a letter to the editor in a Sydney paper after the kindergarten down the road had implemented a buddy program, and he decided that he should write a letter, and the Telegraph decided that it should publish it, because apparently we've never had a buddy in Australia. And I understand that semantics are important, but I don't think they're this important. But of course, what I want to point out here is the fact that what's destroying our domestic culture, or what's replacing our domestic culture, is the fact that kids are watching too much American television. Walter Penzing is probably in his 60s. This letter is from 2002. So he was probably alive when television was introduced to this country, and he was probably particularly young. In the 50 years that television has been in Australia, it hasn't managed to destroy his cultural identity, even though it's been predominantly American from the outset. So what I want to point out is that this fear of Americanization is connected generally to our sense of national identity, or the way that it's articulated to the world. It's just a whipping dog. Anyway, so American content exists in Australia because, or functions in Australia, not because we understand inherently the logics of America, and not because we are in some way little Americans, despite what some people like to think. It works because it is made domestic by a whole range of strategies employed by the domestic broadcasters to make the content profitable, to make their business profitable. And particularly important here is continuity and branding material. Some of my favourite programming matter. Referred to as ident, this is the television that isn't there. It's the television that papers over the gaps when the medium sticks through between programming and advertising. It's the ads for television and for television networks. And it's where we get articulated the idea of the audience that the network is drawing. It serves a dual purpose in that it advertises what's coming up, but it also demonstrates a range of responses for Australian viewers to kind of show how they can participate in the audience that the network is offering them. It's all about creating a community. And so this is the title slide. This is from about 2001. There is a seamlessness in the way in which American content exists on Australian television. Frasier was incredibly successful. We had a program called Sale of the Century. It is an American format, I think, or I know that it's here anyway. And after many years, it was revitalised as Sale of the New Century, and it lasted about a week before it was taken off. And it was replaced with Frasier. And Frasier was just a bit of filler program that was pulled out of the archives that the Australian networks had not paid very much money for, and they were just going to slap it in to fill the gap. Frasier did better figures than anything else that Nine had ever put in the 7 o'clock slot, and so it sat in the slot for close to 4 years. But we moved seamlessly from the national news, which is before Frasier, to Frasier, to Getaway, which is a lifestyle program. People go to the places and get on those paragliding things. Then into ER, and then into the Footy Show. And the Footy Show is about, where this is from, the Footy Show is about one of the national codes, NRL. It's a bit like rugby. There is no armour. They chase pigskin, they beat each other up. And the Footy Show is commentary about footy by a bunch of blokes who like to bloke it up. So it's actually an incredibly Australian program. It plays with a lot of the discourses about Australian masculinity. Now this was a fairly successful lineup. Channel 9 is the preeminent broadcaster. They're certainly the ratings winner. And this lineup won them, I think it was Thursday nights, for about 12 months. Now, the reason, or the way in which these imported programs are made domestic, I think, is demonstrated particularly by the continuity material. I want to show you just a couple of things now to try and explain the way that American television functions, so I can get on to what are some of the challenges Australian networks face. This is from 1995, when ER was just coming to Australia. It should work hopefully. Except there's no audio for something. Oh yes, there is. All right. Okay. What Nine did was stitch together a montage of their branding positions over the years. And they played it over the ER theme song, and then gave us a whole bunch of title slides for domestic programs. I hope that some of this looks familiar, because a lot of them are imported formats, and there's actually a trade in continuity material. Nine's still the one position. I think it was first CBS position, and Nine purchased it, or pinched it really. And so what we get are a lot of the common themes of Australian broadcasting. It starts with the 9 balls, which is, they've dropped now, but were really quite prominent identifier for 9. It was the 9 numeral and these 9 balls. And so it starts with that, and then we get an image of the nation. And television in Australia is often associated with nationalness. We are quite a small nation that is brought together by the fact that we have television. And then played over the soundtrack, we get a whole bunch of Australian programs, and then finally we end up with the series. Sorry, I won't explain. The point is that 9 draws this line of equivalence between all of its programs that it's produced itself, between the network, and between its imported programming. American drama does well in Australia because it's high concept, it's high budget, and it's generally fairly attractive. Now, certain dramas sink and certain dramas swim, and that has to do with the vagaries of the Australian market. CSI does well, Law and Order does well. I'm trying to think of something that's sunk now. Las Vegas, sunk. Chicago Hope, sunk. But I think it's sunk here as well. ER did well. Commander-in-Chief, sunk like a stone. Boston Public...
It's doing the same here, too.
Is it good? Because when it came out, it was like, "Rah!" And everyone was like, Gina Davis! And then, no. Lost does well, but it's ebbing off, which I think it's doing here as well. Desperate Housewives, again, did well, but it's sustaining itself, not on its innovativeness, but on the fact that it's primetime soap now. But anyway, high concept American drama functions in Australia almost as a baseline. And that's why we have the italics on as. American content introduced from the start to start the Australian network, the networks, has always existed as television. It's reliable, some of it's going to be crap, but generally it is television. And so what 9 does in that promo is draw this line between what we understand quality to be, namely high concept American drama, all of their domestic programs, and the network themselves. And they draw this equivalence to say all of this is actually, all of this reflects upon each other, and it is quality. 9's branding position trades on the fact that it is the ratings winner, and it has up until quite recently, for about 10 or 12 years, even a bit longer, been the #1 annual rating network in the country, even though it doesn't do so well in some of the markets. So 9 says we offer you as Australian viewers quality, and all of this program equals quality. The distinctions that are domestic or international are kind of written off along the way. And so that's kind of one of the ways in which American content is made to work in the Australian market. The other way is by foregoing images of the nation altogether and instead selling the community. I talked before about, and this brings us all back to Katie Holmes and why I wasn't just putting her up there because I think she's cute. The third commercial broadcaster in the country is called the 10 Network. In the 1980s it went bust, as did most of the networks, commercial networks in Australia. Too much venture capital, not enough ideas. It went bust. It was bought by CanWest, which is a Canadian company owned by the late Desi Ascot. And it was bought by CanWest in 1991 without a receivership. You can't own, a foreign owner cannot own a television station or a media company in Australia. And so the contract that was drawn up to establish holding companies so that CanWest could maintain a voting right in 10 is a fantastic piece of legislation that lawyers work themselves over. Anyway, 10 became successful by targeting a youth audience. Okay, it said what we're going to do is target 16 to 39s. And so they premiered this strategy with Simpsons, Cops, Beavers. And those were their 3 standout programs. They then added to that lineup things like Seinfeld and Melrose Place. They didn't produce a whole lot of content, or they didn't produce a whole lot of domestic content that was successful. Most of their dramas would run about a season, See, and Australian networks have to produce it and they have to screen it. They don't have to do particularly well. They don't have to renew it for another season. And so, for a long time, they didn't actually produce a whole lot of successful domestic content. What 10 did was move away or dislocate itself from the ideas of nationalism that have been important to Australian brand positions. And instead, they constructed themselves, the network, as the location where youthfulness could be accessed. What they did is basically invent a concept, and I'm calling it youthfulness because it is not youth, and youth is a fallacy anyway, but it is not youth. Law and Order does very well on Channel 10. At one point, we're screening 5 or 6 times a week. What is youthful about Law and Order? It's certainly not much, even though it's good. So what 10 did was create this discursive environment where youthfulness was practiced, and everything in this environment could count as youthful. And they did this by moving away from kind of concrete images and instead creating this kind of no space.
What do you want to be?
This is actually one of my favourite ever positions. It's from 2003. It's on a long-running series that 10's run. But this is when they started to produce domestic programming. They're actually being quite successful. They distinguish themselves from the other networks by not selling the product or the program, but instead selling the lifestyle. And it's traditional youth marketing, but 10 ported it to television. And often their promos would not feature any programming at all. They just talk about all of the things that 10 was offering people. What they do is make youth a referent. Make youth a signifier that has no base referent. So there is no concrete thing that is youth. If you want to be youthful, and who doesn't, all you have to do is come and watch 10's programming. What this managed to do is create an environment where niche economics could be successful. So they took the large pie of Australian television and said, we're not going to bother competing with the other 2 commercial networks for all people, because we're going to lose anyway. Instead, we're going to take 16 to 39, and if we win 16 to 39, then we won for the week. They actually didn't win 16 to 39 very often until 2001. But they told everyone that they did win, and they picked up, this wonderful fallacy of ratings is that, like any statistics, you can pick them up and make them say whatever you want. So they pick up the instances where they did win. What this did was create an economic environment where programs that wouldn't survive on the broad channels could be incredibly popular. And so we end up in an environment where Dawson's Creek is a success in a market that cannot support programs that don't score large figures. 9, through an output deal, acquired the OC in 2003. They premiered it as this kick-ass new youth program. 9 targets a very broad 16 to 54, all people, male and female market. So they premiered the OC as this kick-ass new teen drama. They put it on at 8:30 one night. It lasted 2 episodes before it tanked. They sold the rights to 10. So 9's still making money out of it, but they don't have to screen it. They sold the rights to 10. 10 premiered it, and it became the hit of 2005. This is how they launched it. This one's a quick time, so it might take a little while to load. Or it might just start.
Some shows are just made for you. 90210. Coming to Tuesdays. BOC.
New-age drama. Revisit your attitude.
Coming to Taylor.
Where it belongs.
Okay, so what 10 did is that they set up this equivalency between the viewer at home and the network. And whereas in 9's promo before, the equivalency was set up between the network and you see that little map of Australia between the network and the nation. 10 chooses not to think beyond the network itself. And so they say, we, as Channel 10, are like you, the viewer at home. This is the important thing about TEN's strategy. Chalk. Chalk's on here. They have a logo. And while they were establishing this strategy, what they used to do was play with the logo a lot in their idents, and they'd often, in title cards running between programs, whack the program that was coming up in the logo. It was this funneling device. That says viewer. So what TEN would do is say, we are a window for you, the viewer, to access the wider world of youth culture. By the time we get to the OC, TEN has done away with the idea of them being a window at all. They are the site where youth culture exists. What this does is strip away the ideas of nationalism. Okay, in this model, I don't know if that's right. Anyway, in the logo is window model, viewers are still located in Australia and looking out to the world. In the latter model, there is no national distinctions, and content that is appropriate for you, the viewer, is here on TEN. Now, I'm actually going somewhere with all of this, and it's not just a journey through Australian television. The point is that American content exists as a profitable element on Australian television. However, supply outstrips demand. I don't want to say we have been taught to like American content, but there are a whole bunch of viewers in Australia who do like a whole bunch of programs that not enough other viewers like to keep them on television. It's a problem for viewers everywhere. Programs like The West Wing and The Gilmore Girls are two of my favourite examples, because they're both in Australian 69. They're both, all three of them, in Australia inspired quite passionate followings. But they were on 9, and none of them could draw market share to justify their place on the schedule. So The West Wing famously was shunted around, and then sold to the public broadcaster. And 6 Feet Under used to do 3 or 4 weeks at 11:30 at night before it was preempted for a couple of weeks without notice. In 2004, the hot question on the Australian interwebs was, when is 6 Feet Under coming back? The answer? December 2006. It didn't even come back in ratings time. What's the problem here? Arrgh, pirates. What we've done is, or what's happened is, that for the first time, actually this model, which doesn't refer to TEN at all, this model of distribution in Australia is no longer the only model. There is an alternative. For a long time, the alternative has been DVD release. Okay, and there was quite a bit of press in Australia about how it was possible to nearly keep up with The West Wing here if you knew people in the States who could send you the DVD. The other story I was telling someone before is that for a long time we couldn't use Amazon if we didn't have an American credit card. But Amazon resolved that problem fairly swiftly. And so viewers who are promised something by the network and who don't get it now have the option to go elsewhere. And I think that this is a fundamental problem in a nation that relies so much on imported content, but doesn't have the capacity to screen it. There's a whole other discussion here about the opportunities for multi-channeling and stuff that I don't have time for today. But I want to this is kind of my proposition, and this sums up, I think in this we can see a lot of the things that have been talked about here, particularly Ian's stuff yesterday about fan subbing, and discussion this morning about entertainment, and also even the last 2 papers about community formation and stuff. Television works as a closed expert system. Okay, and this is not mine, I'm gifting this from John Hartley via, so this is Ledbetter via John Hartley. So if anyone want to quote me on this, I'll put some citations later. Television is a closed expert system. You take creative, innovative professionals and you remove them from consumers. You put them in an environment where they can be creative. If you work on Friends, it's somewhere you can swear and tell dirty jokes. But you lock them up away so that they can be creative. They generate a whole bunch of ideas that are then sifted through, trialled out on test markets, and eventually standardized as a format. That format is then pumped down the line to consumers, and consumption becomes a behavioural response. We offer you something that is supposed to make you listen, or make you look, or make you watch, and the system works if we give it to you and you watch. Now in Australia there are a whole bunch of people who are prepared to watch, but they can't get the content. They've been promised the content, but it's no longer around. And there are a whole bunch of other politics to that I'm not doing justice to now, but that I accept exist. The alternative, I think, for Australian networks, and I think perhaps more broadly, is to move to what's called an open innovation network. And this is one where rather than just piping the content down the line to the viewer is offered opportunities to pipe content back up the line. It's about not only creating a community for viewers to participate in, but being a participant in that community yourself. What this does is not only provide viewers with a space to actually contribute, but also reward them for contribution. And the solution to that problem is just letting go a little bit, and not calling everyone a pirate, but accepting that being a member of a community has benefits that flow both ways. That's actually where I'm going to conclude now. I hope that some of this has been kind of relevant. I realise that the American system is vastly different, and I feel a little bit like Raymond Williams, because when I got here the other night, there was a jarring moment where I couldn't work out whether I was watching a program or whether I was watching advertising, and I thought I was kind of unfazed with the commercial system. But in Australia, we have they do these little break bumpers, and they love them, and they do them a whole lot, so that whenever you go to a break, it's announced as a break. And I actually thought that was an American thing, but I realised now I think it's a British thing. I know that I saw MTV do some the other night, but the transition is so seamless that it just was a little bit jarring. So I'm happy to take questions. If anyone has any fruit, I'm happy to stand in the front so you can hit with it now. But that's where I'm going to finish.
I'm going to jump in first.
Yeah.
And one of my questions is something you alluded to just a little bit, but to me and Turner is very of great interest.
Yeah.
Understanding when you look back at what you viewed and what you watched, what shows do you feel a strong affinity to, and as you go forward, are they segmented by those that were developed specifically for your audience, or again, this American influence?
Yeah. No. For a television academic, I only watched the public broadcaster until I was 12. Not because my parents were strict, just because I liked Doctor Who. And it was on the public broadcaster. So when I think back to the programs that I enjoyed as a boy, it is segmented by age, and there is my recollection is a quite segmented one that had periods. I know that up until I was 12 or even a little bit older, the programs that I liked were a smattering, but predominantly British and Australian. Australia produces some of the world, or co-produces some of the world's best children's drama, and it's actually something that's quite dear to me. But when I was a lad, there were some good options in terms of children's drama. So programs that were specifically relevant to my age. There's a tendency in young people to watch up or view up. And there's a component of my thesis involved going and discussing with some kind of 14 to 17-year-olds what they thought of television and what they thought of youth programming and the representations of youth. And what we see with young people, particularly young boys, is that they're aspirational viewers. Young girls do as well. So when you are 14, you want to watch programs about people who are a bit older than you. And when you are 16, you want to watch Melrose. In fact, when you're 40, you want to watch Melrose as well. When you're a young lad, you may not necessarily be interested in children's drama, say at 12 or 14, but you're more interested in cop programs and those sorts of things. So there's an aspirational component to viewing there. Can you just, I'm just dallying, I realise, around actually answering the question. So can you just ask me again? I'm formulating this thought in my head. I'm actually trying to address what you asked, I just haven't let it go.
More thinking in terms of
Yep.
looking at you growing up in a certain culture and as you leave that culture, say, coming here this summer,
Yep.
what do you want to come with you? What is it that you're going to seek out? Doctor Who, or the Australian cookie episode,
Yep.
or
Yep.
what's your sweet spot? And how do you find that?
Yeah, at my age, the sweet spot is quality drama, with a big Q and a qualifier underneath it, and sporting programs. I got an email last night from someone at home telling me that there's actually in Boston quite a large Australian expat community, and apparently it is possible to get the football here. And so, as a viewer coming from Australia and moving internationally, I feel quite comfortable moving, particularly here, to an environment where all the content is American. Because if it's not the programs, it's certainly the form that I feel familiar with. Since we got cable in 1995, we have the Cartoon Network now, but we also have a Fox O&O called Fox 8 that screens a whole lot of kind of teen drama and stuff, and we get Lifetime and those sorts of things. So as a viewer coming here, I'm certainly looking for the form rather than the content itself. I know that doesn't answer your question, but I'm having a little bit of trouble getting it because I don't know what the answer is. It's like a footy.
Mine's more kind of a comment and an observation, because I think one of the interesting things about this, it's all about resources and funding. And for me, being from Ireland, it's the same kind of situation. You look at programming here, for example, because the money is behind it, the funding, the programming is done, high quality programming, and it's sent out. Now, the funny thing is, then you ask yourself, is culture influencing culture? So American culture influencing other cultures? And it's funny, because then there's stereotyping of culture, and I'll give you an example. Importing of programming in here. So for example, if you go on PBS and you look at Irish programming, unfortunately, they only screen it at St. Patrick's Week, or March. and lo and behold, it's always, it's either Riverdance, it's either, what is it, Babby Kiss Angel, all this stuff that's like 20 years old.
Yeah.
And you can take the same thing as Benny Hill, any self-respecting Englishman who looks at it and says, it's stereotyping, it's faulty powers of Ben Hill. People don't watch that there.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
something that's years ago. So people look at it that way. And the other interesting thing from an American programming standpoint is that if they see something that is a good property, they'll take it themselves and change it. The Office is a prime example. Look at The Office in the UK, and then look at over here and they change it. There are some people who are purist Americans who only watch the real Office versus the American version.
They do the same with coupling. I think which they took from the UK and remade here. I think they actually did quite well with The Office. And I've seen a bit of it at home, a bit on the plane, and the translation works because they took the form rather than the content, and they managed to make the form domestically relevant, and that's sort of the same thing. We don't do sitcoms in Australia. We have a tradition of doing sitcoms, partly because the form and the canned laughter, I think, we accept as being a little American. And that's not to suggest that it comes with that it transports some sort of cultural values, but rather we expect to see Americans in sitcoms behaving in particular ways. And we accept that there is a critical distance between us as viewers and that content, such that it exists off in the television ether. Whereas domestic drama suffers from the weight of representation. And so if it answers the problem with Heartbreak High here, and I think why do quite well internationally, but here, when I say here, I'm in Australia. I'm in Australia right now, this portion of carpet, is that Heartbreak High, and Dawson's Creek paints this wonderful stalker fantasy about, star-crossed lovers and kind of fatalism. Whereas Heartbreak High was about gritty urban youthfulness. If you're a young person and they say, this is what being a young person in Australia is like today, and you go, no it's not, then resolving the critical distance between you and the program is quite different. It's quite difficult, and for some Australian viewers, insurmountable. Whereas the distance between Australian viewers and an American sitcom actually adds to part of the relationship they develop with it. It is a flight of fancy.
Okay, I'm trying to think of other explanatory paradigms, and I was wondering about the culture of self-deprecation that seems so Australian. But, I mean, maybe what I'm curious about,
Yeah.
because I just finished a 5-year study in Europe of TV and identity, and this problematic was, of course, very central to it. At least in a lot of European settings, I'll take the
Yeah.
Dutch in particular, where it's the same dynamic. American programming outrates the local, and you get their mandates to produce local. There, I think one of the key reasons is when you talk to people about how they characterize high production values, slightly more universal themes when they're finding the local stuff. But the thing that leaps out the most to them, both in terms of cinematic Hollywood production and American TV production, is pacing. And why it's pacing is because they pluck the ads out
Yeah.
and they bumper them. So the
Yeah.
front end and the back end have 8-minute ad chunks
Yep. Yep.
and no ads in between. So to an American viewer used to ads, the thing's punctured like 4 or 5 times.
Yep.
The narrative is a roller coaster. It's not a 3-act structure, it's a 5 or 6-act structure. When they see it there, it's like an erratic, wildly moving narrative that has full cliffhangers.
Yeah.
So compared to stuff there that's crafted for the hour slot, their stuff looks slow and boring compared to the Americans. How is it shown in Australia?
No, commercial networks run like commercial networks here. They actually imported the US system, so the programs, they just slot ads into the ad slots.
Every ad slot is filled.
Every ad slot is
So
filled.
it is something.
Every ad slot is filled in, and it runs actually. I haven't been able to. I had this house once with a girl called Sugar, and we used to watch Law and Order like it was going out of fashion. We were both finishing study, and that was what we did. And so I haven't been able since to watch an episode of Law and Order, but I'm recognising the cases. So I think before I go home, I'm actually going to sit down and watch one and see if it is the same. Because my understanding of it is that they just put ads in exactly the same slots. Comparatively, there was a little bit of thought for a time, or some discussion about the fact that Australian content was paced differently, and that the key distinction was that the stories were simpler, or that they unfolded at a different pace, even though they were still fitting the same ad slots. The trick with domestic content, but, is that if it is good, it rates. And so Channel 10 in 2001 premiered a program called The Secret Life of Us, which did 5 seasons, about 6 young people living in Sydney. And it was actually really good television and outrated competing American content because it was well paced, it fit things. It's the same with McLeod's Daughters, which I believe is being imported here. It's girls in the bush, R.N. Williams, riding horses, working on a ranch, stuff, doing it for themselves, sisters and stuff. And it's actually a lot faster than the competing cop drama, which is a country cop program called Blue Hills. And so I think that pacing is an issue, but the programs are kind of preserved as they can from here.
I'm Canadian, and I recognize some of what you're saying, and I wondered if somebody asked Martin Short, an American interviewer asked Martin Short why so many comedians in the States were Canadian.
Yeah.
And his answer was, well, you grew up watching TV. I grew up watching American TV. So he's trying to suggest there's this slight kind of distance, and sometimes it's critical distance, capital C, sometimes it's critical distance, lowercase c, and sometimes it's just distance. And I wondered if that difference between full-on engagement and that slight remove is the difference between Channel 9 engagement and Channel 10 engagement.
Yes, and I think that's why Channel 10 runs this, what's been a very successful tagline, which is seriously. Channel 10 employs, they encourage their audience to be playful. The little trailer before has a whole bunch of phrases that are supposed to sum up the values you as a viewer should have. And it's things like being happy, being strong, being cheering, it's playfulness, it's irony. And there is a step away that they encourage you to take from some of the program. Particularly when programs like Pumped screen on Channel 10, and the whole thing is just a shemogle. It's supposed to, it did alright, but you as the viewer are not supposed to take it particularly seriously. And 10 has really employed seriously, and it's about its 6th or 8th year, as an ironic statement for its viewers to adopt. So I think that you're right.
More questions or other questions?
As you know, so I was just comment to pick up on your ground, that it was very interesting because I think there is that the ability of other cultures to look at other cultures' programming to distance themselves. And I think especially with post 9/11, when a lot of people within Ireland were looking at American programming and all this kind of stuff, where they could there was a certain affinity to the individuals that they could, but there were part of them where they felt they might be somewhat American, part of the American culture, but not part of the American politics or idealism and all that.
Yeah.
Which is a completely other kind of road to go down. But
I suppose the point I want to finish on is that I think that there is a common understanding, and that you can watch America, but that there's not a trade in cultural values, which is the way that the American-Australian relationship certainly has long been contextualized.